5 years ago today, on December 12, 2015, 195 countries reached common ground and adopted the Paris Agreement, the historic and ambitious climate treaty to combat climate change and pave the way for a low-carbon, resilient, and sustainable planet and future. But what is the Paris Agreement? Why is it considered a landmark treaty celebrated by countries around the world? And how can it really save our planet from the present and intensifying effects of the climate crisis? The Paris Agreement is a United Nations decision adopted by heads of state and world leaders at the 21st Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. This was held in Paris, France in 2015, hence it's called the Paris Agreement. Governments need to ratify or give formal consent in order to meet the minimum requirements before the Paris Agreement enters into force or considered operational. This happened on November 4, 2016, a month after at least 55 countries accounting for at least 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions had ratified the agreement. Now, there are already 189 countries that have ratified the agreement. The Paris Agreement is an ambitious climate treaty because of its main goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while pursuing efforts to limit it further to 1.5 degrees. What these climate pathways or climate thresholds require are significant and deep cuts to GHG emissions, especially from the developed and high-emitting countries, industries, and sectors. The Paris Agreement adheres to the principles of climate justice, equity, and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That while the Paris Agreement acknowledges that climate change is a common concern for all countries and humankind, we have varying ways to take climate action in light of our different national circumstances. This is why the Paris Agreement urges developed countries to undertake economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets, as well as provide financial resources, technologies, and capacity development opportunities to developing countries. Particularly on the mobilization of climate finance, this should represent a progression beyond previous efforts. These are the three main provisions that the developed countries are obliged to make available for developing countries, which are also urged to prioritize actions that will build resilience to climate impacts. As the Paris Agreement relies on a robust accounting system to provide clarity on action and support by both the developed and developing countries, it articulates three important provisions. These are the transparency framework, compliance mechanism, and global stocktake. This requires information on mitigation and adaptation support and action that countries must submit and will be subjected to an international technical expert review. A mechanism will also facilitate the implementation and promote compliance on these actions. A global stocktake, which will take place in 2023 and every 5 years thereafter, will then assess the collective progress of the goals of the Paris Agreement. In the compliance mechanism, countries must provide a national inventory report of their GHG emissions by sources and removals by sinks, as well as the information necessary to track progress in their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Going back to the main objective of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius, countries are expected to support this goal through the submission of these NDCs. But what are these NDCs, and how can it really help in limiting the increase of the Earth's temperature to 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius? NDCs are GHG reduction targets that countries formally communicate and submit to the UN. It conveys the mitigation and adaptation options and strategies that they will undertake to achieve their NDC targets. Consider these NDCs as their pledges and contributions to ensuring that the 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius global climate threshold is not breached. Earlier on in 2015, countries were asked to submit a similar commitment called the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs. These GHG reduction commitments from countries, however, would lead to a world with a global warming level of more than 2 degrees Celsius. This is a crucial year because at the close of 2020 is the deadline for countries to submit their first official NDCs. But so far, 164 countries have not updated their targets. 19 countries have submitted new NDC targets, and 6 countries have proposed new NDC targets. Many countries have expressed that the COVID-19 pandemic has delayed their NDC processes, but there are those that still committed to submit this year. Others have stated that they might have to do so in 2021, ahead of the 26th Conference of Parties, which was postponed this year. 5 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, how much has changed? Are we on track in achieving the goals of this historic climate treaty? Are countries keeping their commitments and responsibilities to the Paris Agreement? There are positive developments at the global level that give us reason to believe that the Paris goals can be achieved. In the aspect of climate finance, advanced economies have agreed to jointly mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020, a large portion of which will be channeled to the Green Climate Fund, or GCF. The GCF has pooled in $20.3 billion as resources for financing adaptation and mitigation projects from developing countries. This was a record year for the GCF for approving over $2 billion worth of projects, raising the total amount of approved projects to $7.3 billion, which, including co-financing from project proponents, amounts to $23.3 billion in funding. According to the UNFCCC, the number of local governments and businesses committing net zero GHG emissions has roughly doubled in less than a year as they prioritize climate action and COVID-19 recovery. There also are now 127 countries representing 63% of the world's emissions that have also pledged carbon neutrality. Quite recently, China committed net zero emissions by 2060. And the European Union, South Korea, and Japan by 2050. US President-elect Joe Biden has also committed to do so by 2050 by investing $2 trillion on clean energy and technology in over 4 years. Think tanks point out that these commitments could lower global warming to 2.1 degrees Celsius, but it still falls short on the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate goal. But as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported in 2018, the 1.5-degree target is entirely possible if global net emissions of carbon dioxide fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. The world's leading scientific body on climate change also stated that this would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. These are critical considerations that world leaders and citizens need to think about as we mark the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement today. The Paris Agreement is already driving and scaling up climate action, but the most crucial moments of decision and action lie ahead of us. To this day, we must ask our world leaders to heed the science and exhibit greater leadership and action. As climate reality leaders, we have the power and the ability to influence the outcome of this crisis. The most urgent task is to ensure that the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate goal is not breached due to apathy and negligence. We must continue demanding that countries, including our own, submit and pledge better NDCs this year in order to have a better reality for all. We do this while we continue with our own climate initiatives, exhibiting the kind of leadership and action we demand from the rest of the world.